everybody to stay muted during our session, and we're going to get started here in a moment. We're also going to ask everybody to keep their videos off with so many people. Also, if we could keep everybody, keep the chat to a minimum. The chat can be distracting as it pops up while people are trying to see what's going on on their screens. If you requested CPDUs or paid for CEUs, I'm going to post a link in the chat box in a moment, and you can go to the Google Doc and sign in that you are here. If you have any questions about CEUs, my name is Chelsea Byers, and you can private message me. If you do not need to sign in unless you are seeking CEUs or CPDUs. This session is being recorded, just so everybody knows. Again, so we do ask that everybody keeps their videos off and that everybody stays muted. Oh, my sound is off today. All right, and I have that it is straight up noon, so I'm going to toss it over to my colleague, Diane Reinhold. She is our host for today's session.
Thank you everyone for joining us. As Chelsea mentioned, my name is Diane Reinhold and I'm a nutrition and wellness educator with the University of Illinois Extension. And I would like to welcome all of you to the Summer Self-Care Series. This series is a collaboration between the Illinois Extension and the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute at the University of Illinois. And it is designed to connect those across the state with researchers at the university and provide evidence-based educational programming. So again, we're very excited that you are here. If you have any questions during the program, as Chelsea mentioned, go ahead and please type them in the chat box. If you are calling in, please hold your questions until the end of today's session. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this series, Leila Shinn. Leila, did you want to introduce yourself, or should I?
Sure, I can introduce myself.
All right.
A little slide. Thank you, Diane. Hi, everyone.
And Leila, you are a little difficult to hear. If you could maybe move your mic a little, maybe a little closer.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'd like to take a moment to thank my advisor, Dr. Hannah Holscher, who I adapted these slides from. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So an introduction on myself. I completed my Bachelor of Science in Food Science and Human Nutrition here at the University of Illinois. Okay, let's see. People are saying it's hard to hear. I'm going to try and call in if we can bear with me for 1 minute.
All right, well, Leila is calling in. I'll just tell you a little bit more about her. Leila, as she mentioned, did complete her Bachelor in Food Science and Human Nutrition with a concentration in Dietetics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in May of 2015. From there, she went to Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, where she completed her dietetic internship and Master in Clinical Nutrition and specialized in pediatrics. She then became a registered dietitian nutritionist in June of 2017 and interned as a nutrition research intern with the National Dairy Council, where she focused her efforts on the scientific translation, which inspired her to return to school and pursue her career in research. Leila is currently a third-year PhD candidate at UC in the Division of Nutritional Sciences. Her research has been with Dr. Hannah Holscher. Nutrition and human microbiome laboratory focuses on how diet impacts the gut microbiome with a goal of creating personalized dietary recommendations based on these microbes. So that's very interesting. And when she is not doing her school or lab work, she enjoys cooking with her husband, spending time with her 3 cats and dog, and binging on the latest Netflix series. So, Leila, did that give you some time to call in? So it looks like you are muted.
I
Okay,
just got
wonderful.
on. Can you
Yep,
hear me
we
better
can hear
now?
you. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that introduction. So we can move into the presentation. Let me get, okay. So after today's talk, you should be able to identify dietary factors that impact the human gastrointestinal or GI microbiota. Compare and contrast how different types of foods which contain fiber differentially impact the GI microbiota, and establish a connection between the GI microbiota and health. And so let's dive in, starting with an overview of terms but in order for fiber that's added to a food product to be defined as fiber, it has to have at least one health benefit here. So it has to either improve glucose levels, improve cholesterol levels, blood pressure, increase the frequency of bowel movements, or help us with that feeling of feeling full after eating. On the other hand, prebiotics are foods that are beneficial for our gut microbes. So we can't digest these foods, but our microbes can through a process called fermentation, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And our gut microbes then produce beneficial products from these prebiotics. And so overall, in order for something to be considered a prebiotic, it has to be used by our gut microbes and have health benefits. And so it's important to remember that not all fibers are prebiotics, but most prebiotics are fibers. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on fiber as a prebiotic, but I wanted to briefly touch on probiotics since this is also a big topic that people are interested in. And so a probiotic is a live microorganism that gives us health benefits. And so these products will support the gut microbes that we already have present in our GI tracts. And they're present in various foods like yogurt, for example. And they're also available as supplements. But how do these probiotics help? So they impact our immune system as well as increased digestion and absorption of different nutrients in our GI tracts. They help to keep harmful microbes in check, and they're also capable of producing different vitamins that we need for our health. And so thinking about these different definitions, I want to get into a little more of an overview of some background information for us to understand the research I'll talk about later. And so from research, we know that the composition of our diet impact the digestive secretions that are released throughout our bodies. They also impact transit time of fecal matter moving throughout our GI tracts, and they also can impact absorption. But furthermore, diet not only provides a source of nutrients for us, but also for the microbes within our GI tracts as well. And aside from providing a source of nutrients, diet can also provide a source of microbes directly, as I said earlier, from things like yogurt that we know contains live active cultures. And so thinking about our GI tracts, when we consume something, it first enters our stomach, and then it moves through our small intestine, the first part of which is called the duodenum. And then the later parts of our small intestine are the jejunum and ileum. And then from here, the food enters the colon. And so these different parts of our GI tract have different environments. So in the same way that a palm tree could thrive in Florida, we all know that it wouldn't do so well here in Illinois due to our harsh winters. And so microbes also have their niche areas of the GI tract, and this is due to the different environments. So most of us have heard that our stomachs are very acidic, and they're also fairly rich in oxygen. And so microbes don't really like that type of environment. But as we move down the GI tract, we get a more neutral pH. and things move quickly through our small intestine, which has reduced oxygen as well as a mucus layer surrounding it. But once we get to the colon, we have a more neutral pH and things move more slowly through our colon. There's minimal chemicals called bile acids that break down fats, and there's low oxygen and a thick mucus layer. And so these two last points are really important for a lot of microbes. So most microbes prefer to have that low oxygen environment, and they can feed off of that thick mucus layer. And so you'll see that most of our microbes are present in our colon. And so we have small amounts of microbes in our stomach. So many of us have maybe heard of H. pylori in our stomach. It's often misconstrued that we can get ulcers from stress, but it's actually due to this bacterium called H. pylori being in too much of an abundance. When we move into our small intestine, we see that we have about 10,000 to thousands of millions of microbes. But our colon is really where those microbes are going to thrive, and we can have up to trillions of microbes per milliliter of product in our colon. And so I mentioned that term fermentation a few slides back, and I want to touch on this in a little more detail. And so I like to think of microbes as having their own toolkit that allows them to ferment foods that we can't digest, like fiber. So microbes may have a kit with a hammer, screwdriver, and wrench that our bodies don't have. And so these tools allow these microbes to ferment or break down fiber, for example, for their own use, since we can't use it. And so here's a structure of one type of fiber. And as you can see, it's pretty complex, and our bodies cannot use this. But with these tools, the microbes are able to break down these different structures and use them for energy, which downstream will have those positive health benefits that we touched on a little bit earlier. And some of these benefits that these microbes make are from metabolites they create. And one of these compounds is called short-chain fatty acids. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into details of short-chain fatty acids today, because there could be a whole talk on the benefits of these and how they're created. But I just want to bring this term to your attention and point out that these can have multiple beneficial effects on things like appetite, the movement of food through our GI tracts, our metabolism, and even different anti-cancer properties. And so we hear about all these benefits from fiber, but how much fiber do we actually need? It's important for us to think about how much fiber is necessary to see these benefits, because we need to be eating enough for our microbes to benefit from it and therefore benefit us. So it's recommended that we get 14 grams of fiber per day for every 1,000 calories we eat. So in general, that's about 38 grams of fiber per day for men and 25 grams per day for women. And so I'd like you all to guess in the chat how much fiber you think an average American gets per day. So how many grams per day of fiber do you think the average American eats? Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of low guesses, and unfortunately, all of you are right on point there. So on average, an average American gets about 10 to 15 grams per day. And so we're getting less than half the recommended amount. And so this is a nutrient that we need to work on increasing in our diets. And by doing this, we can see these beneficial impacts on our microbes as well. And so I like to think of this in the context of my plate. And so I think many of us hear the word fiber and we automatically think of that grains group, but we can also get fiber from fruits, vegetables, and even protein sources like legumes and nuts. We want to think about, again, how much of these foods do we need to eat per day? And so based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet, it's recommended by my plate that we eat these different amounts of these food groups per day. And I will point out here that eating a variety of foods will also help us to get a variety of different types of fibers, and different types of fibers will have those differential health effects. And so I really wanted to go through this brief background so we can kind of set the stage, but I would like to get into the research because I think that that's more exciting. And so moving into the research, I think a big question that a lot of people have is how microbiome studies work. And so let's say that you're joining a microbiome study in our lab, and we want to look at the difference between a Mediterranean-based diet, which would consider our treatment group, and a typical American diet, which would be considered our control group. What we'd ask you to do to start is eat your normal diet as you normally would before you start any type of treatment diet. And then we would ask that you give us a fecal sample so that we can measure what your microbes are like at baseline. So then from there, we would either start you on the controlled feeding diet of the Mediterranean diet, meaning controlled feeding, meaning that we would provide you all food necessary for this study. And so that's a really important thing to consider when designing these studies, because if we're not controlling everything you're feeding and you can eat whatever you want, there's some factors that could impact different parts of your microbiome. And so the best study design would be for us to provide you all of your food so we know exactly what you're eating. And then once you're on this diet for a set amount of time, we would take your fecal sample there to see how that changed your microbes. And then we would have what's called a washout period. So we would have a period of time where you would go back to eating your normal diet. And the reason we want to do this rather than having you go straight into the next treatment is that there might be some residual effects from this diet if we go straight into the study control. And so in order to make sure that we're really measuring the effect of the diet alone, we want to have that washout period so we can keep everything under control. And then ideally as well, we would have what's called a crossover design. So you would go through both the control arm and the treatment arm of the diet. On the other hand, there's also studies called parallel arm designs. And in these, there would be one group of people that goes through this diet and a different group of people that goes through the control diet. But the reason we want to do the control or the crossover design in this study is that way that we can account for any individual differences. So if we're able to measure what your body responded like with these different types of diets, we can control for those differences that might occur between individuals. And then with that, we would take a fecal sample after each of these diets that you tried. And so when we get the fecal sample, we put it into smaller tubes and we flash freeze them in liquid nitrogen and store them in these giant -80 freezers in our laboratory. And once we're done with our studies, what we'll do is we'll extract the microbial DNA from these samples. And then from that, we have a sequencing center that gives us back all of these reads. And that tells us what microbes are present in your sample. And so knowing how these studies work, we are able to do research on how diet impacts our microbiome. And so what studies have told us so far is that habitual diet, or what you normally eat, is related to the composition of our microbiota. Also, that we're getting, we saw with 16 grams per day of these two types of fiber, there was an increase in 2 different types of bacteria. And when different participants were given 5 and 7.5 grams per day of agave inulin, which is a different type of fiber, they saw similar increases in that same type of bacteria, as well as those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. And then finally, another study showed that when people ate 12 grams per day of inulin, they saw an increase in that same bacteria and a decrease in bacteria that's been associated with negative effects. And so here I really want us to take away that we really need to consider those different doses or amounts and the different types of fiber and how they impact the microbiota. And then from these, we can see different impacts on our health because of those microbes being increased as well. And so one of these studies showed that when we ate 10 grams per day of inulin, there was a decreased amount of different types of markers that cause inflammation in our gut, and therefore it had a positive impact on the immunity. A different study had a positive increase of a feeling of fullness and satiety when people ate 21 grams of a certain type of fiber. And then there's also been studies showing body composition to be impacted by these fiber types and microbes. And so different types of fiber in different amounts showed a decrease in body mass as well as a decrease in fat overall. And then we've also seen different impacts on glucose levels. So 16 grams per day of a certain type of fiber has been shown to decrease glucose levels as well. And so again, really considering that those different fiber types in different amounts can have those beneficial impacts on different aspects of our health. And so from here, I want to touch on our research that's done here on campus in our lab. And so thinking back to that my plate context, we want to think about how dietary trials allow us to characterize how foods impact our microbiota. And so within our lab, we've done different studies from different portions of the my plate, except for dairy at this point in time. But we looked at how avocado, broccoli, whole grains, walnuts, and almonds have impacted the microbiome. For today's purposes, I'll be talking about these studies, but I will not be mentioning avocado because it's actually under the process of getting published right now. So if any of you are interested in reading that research article, it'll be out in the Journal of Nutrition in the coming months. And so starting with our walnut trial, again, this occurred at the University of Illinois. And so this was a controlled feeding trial, again, meaning that we gave the participants everything they ate, and they crossed over between the control group and the treatment group. And so these participants were given a typical American diet as control diet for 3 weeks. And then they had a 1-week washout period where they ate their normal diet. And then the treatment arm was the exact same American diet, but it was scaled down to include 1.5 servings of walnuts per day. And so when participants ate these different diets, we were able to see that there was an increase in these different types of bacteria. So I'm going to orient you to this chart because there's a lot of these throughout this presentation. And so we can kind of go quicker through them once we kind of get an idea of how to read this. And so down here, you'll see the different types of bacteria that we were interested in looking at. And then on this axis here, it's the percent of sequences, or basically the amount of bacteria that we saw. And so this bacteria, called Faecalibacterium, has been shown to increase with walnuts. And so this has been shown to have anti-inflammatory effects in other studies. Roseburia was also increased in the walnut group, as well as another bacteria called Dialister. And so we do see these clear differences between those that added walnuts to their diet versus those that were in that control group. When we look at our almond trial, again with that controlled crossover design, these participants went through that 3-week treatment again. But I think this trial is also very interesting because this study considered food form. So the participants were kind of given that same control-based diet, but they also were given almonds that were whole, roasted, chopped, or almond butter, so processed down. And then they had that washout period, and they went between each of these 5 different arms of the study. And so this was important for looking at food form, and if the form of the food we eat differentially impacts our microbes. And so we did see that this bacterium, called Bifidobacterium, increased in the control group compared to those that ate almonds. And we saw an increase in Roseburia, like we did with walnuts, as well as a bacteria called Lachnospira. And what's interesting is if we look at the different food forms here, we see that almond butter here was almost exactly the same as the control. And so to us, because that almond butter had been broken down and processed into that paste and those shells aren't really there anymore, we don't see that beneficial effect of the fiber that we see when we're eating whole almonds, for example, or even chopped almonds that still have some of those skins intact. And so we do want to think about food form as well when we're eating different types of nuts or other foods, for example. In our broccoli trial, again, that same gold standard design, participants ate 200 grams of broccoli with 20 grams of radish. And people have asked before, why the radish? So in order to be the most feasible, we bulk ordered broccoli, but in order to keep that for a long enough period of time for the participants, we needed to add radish to it because we froze them. And when you freeze broccoli, it gets rid of this important compound that's beneficial in broccoli. And adding this radish didn't add any extra fiber or anything, but it added that compound back. So it mimics eating raw broccoli, which is what we wanted to look at. And so again, these participants either went through both the control and the intervention for a certain amount of time. And here we saw a significant increase again in this Bacteroides bacteria, both in the broccoli compared to the control. So it actually increased in the broccoli group, but decreased in the control group. And so this bacteria has actually been shown to be higher in lean individuals compared to obese individuals who tend to have a higher amount of this bacteria called Firmicutes. And so we saw this positive impact from broccoli as well. And then finally, touching on our whole grain study, these participants were given a 7-day menu cycle of a standard American diet. And so those diets then added different treatments, including cereal, granola, trail mix, or fruit bars. And again, they went through that control group, and then the oats group and barley group. And so I want to point out here actually that this one is a parallel arm. And so there were different participants in each of these studies. And so they were given 4.5 servings per 1,800 calories of whole grains, depending on which group they were in. And so we see here that those in the control group had a decreased amount of that beneficial microbe Roseburia. And oats was somewhat decreased, but not nearly as much as those that didn't have any oats in their diet. And then barley had a beneficial increase in that Roseburia bacteria as well. And so it's important to think about which macronutrients can impact our GI microbiome based on these studies. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, we often think about fiber, but fat can also impact our microbiome, as we've seen with walnuts and almonds. Those have fat content in them, and those can impact the microbiome. Again, as we talked about, fiber can impact it. And protein, again, as we've seen in nuts and also some in whole grains as well, can impact the microbiota. And so our diet as a whole has the ability to impact our microbes, not only certain foods and nutrients, but the entire variety of what we're eating. And so it's important to know that eating a rich diet and different types of and sources of fibers will help us to support that more diverse GI microbiota. And so I have a little spoiler here for our avocado study, but we did see an increase in some of these bacteria here. Our walnuts and almonds also had these bacteria increase that we touched on in those slides. And then broccoli had that increased Bacteroides, as well as oats and barley having that increased Roseburia. And so if we think about these as a whole, again, the key takeaway message from this is that we want to think about the food or fiber source we're consuming, the dose, and the form, because all of these matter in having different impacts in our microbes. Both providing nutrients for us by producing different vitamins and hormones. But outside of the gut, our gut microbes also bolster our immune system. They influence different organs in our body as well, so they have impact outside of the gut. They also affect circulating blood lipids and produce different hormones that can impact things like how hungry we are as well. And so in order to keep these microbes happy, we want to make sure that we take antibiotics and any other drugs that could influence our microbiome only as needed. So if you are prescribed an antibiotic for a certain infection, it's important that you take that in its entirety, but be careful in taking antibiotics. So if you really don't need an antibiotic, you shouldn't be taking one because that can impact your gut microbiome. We can also consume probiotics as well as prebiotics to help keep our microbes happy. Again, eating that diverse range of health versus disease. Exercising has also been shown to have a positive impact on our gut microbes. And it's important to note that different life stages may require different approaches. And so, for example, infants don't have their microbiome as established as we do as adults. And so we need to think about those things as different recommendations apply to different age groups. And so the key takeaways from this are that diet impacts the human GI microbiota, as we saw with our different foods in context of my plate. And eating different types of foods which contain fiber differentially impact our GI microbiota. And then finally, microbes are linked to human health. And so I also want to share this slide with you, and I know the slide will be available for all of you on the website. And so I didn't want to dive too much into a lot of things because I know there will be a lot of questions here, but these resources here are some really great science-backed resources that can provide you some more information on different things in terms of microbiome sequencing, as well as different probiotics and prebiotics as well. And so with that, I am happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Leila. Our first question is, I have issues with gut health affecting her anxiety level, or the individual's anxiety levels. Do you have any recommendations with foods that affect anxiety levels?
Yes, so that is actually out of my wheelhouse, but I do know that different microbes are able to impact different hormones such as serotonin, which has been linked to mood. And so I think trying to focus on a diverse diet overall, so again, making sure we're eating enough of that fiber from different foods such as fruits and vegetables could help with those different things. But there also might be other impact as well outside of the gut, although the gut can have a huge impact. And so that would be something important that you could talk about with a medical team, including a physician as well as a dietitian.
All right, our next question would be, you talked a lot about fiber and you were talking about legumes and nuts. And so if you have an allergy to legumes and nuts, what should you consume then?
So different beans can be a great source of protein as well in that food group. So again, I would make sure that you're communicating with your physician and medical team to make sure that you're not going to be consuming anything that may cause an allergic reaction. But beans are also another great source of protein that can provide that fiber for your gut microbes as well.
All right, our next question is about allergies also. Is it possible for the gut microbiome to be related to the development of food allergies?
Sure.
I am not familiar with that area as much,
Okay.
but I do think there is some research out there that has implications, for example, with infant microbiome and how down the line that can different microbiomes in infancy can be related to allergy development down the line, but that's something that's not in my expertise, that I don't feel comfortable commenting on.
Nope, that's quite all right. So some of the question, well, I'll ask this next one. How can one determine what causes inability to digest certain foods? So not having a true allergy, but just it not agreeing with you or feeling like it's sitting in your gut for hours.
So I think it depends on what type of food it is. So if it is a very high fiber food, I've even experienced where if I've eaten a very high fiber meal, when I haven't really been having that much fiber intake and being like a typical American, I'll tend to have, that gastrointestinal distress because your microbes are kind of working over time to kind of break those things down. And so in terms of a high fiber food, I would suggest kind of working through adding them in small amounts. So start with a small amount of fiber and gradually each day build up the amount until you get to a point where you're meeting your recommendation. And then kind of move it back. If you're kind of feeling that distress again, you can always just add a little more at a time until your body kind of adapts to that amount of fiber. And that can help with you digesting those as well, because I think a big part of that is just feeling that distress and bloating from all of the microbes breaking that down and producing all that gas.
Okay, in the walnut study, what was the serving size for that particular study?
So for that study, they were given 1.5 servings per day, which was 42 grams.
42
so
grams.
A serving of walnuts is about an ounce, or about 7 walnuts, but they were given 1.5 servings for the study.
Okay, and what was the serving size for the avocado?
The avocado was about half of an avocado per day.
Okay, and then did they eat those items daily?
Yes, so these participants ate these items every day in certain amounts. So the avocado study was different in that it was not a controlled feeding study like we talked about. So they were only provided one meal a day that had that half of avocado in it. And then throughout the rest of the day, so for breakfast and dinner, they ate their normal diet. But with these other studies that I mentioned, they were given all of their foods throughout the entire study, and they ate those foods every day for the amount of time. So for example, in the almond study, they ate almonds every day for 3 weeks, and then they switched into the next arm and ate almonds again for another 3 weeks. So I think a lot of our participants are often tired of the specific food we give them by the end of these specific studies.
Who can prescribe probiotics and prebiotics?
So I don't believe that probiotics or prebiotics can necessarily be prescribed because they're not technically a medication. But if you talk, again, with someone who's an expert in gastrointestinal health, like a gastroenterologist, or even your primary care physician, to talk about different probiotics and prebiotics, they can kind of help you to determine which ones would be safe for you, especially if you have certain health conditions. There might be some that can cause different issues, but they're over-the-counter products, and so they're not prescribed by any healthcare providers.
Okay, and besides antibiotics, what other types of drugs affect the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so there are different drugs that are involved, like proton pump inhibitors that are used to treat indigestion or acidic reflux. And we know antibiotics, of course, can impact the microbiome as well. There's also different diabetes drugs like metformin that can differentially impact the microbiome. And then if you think of things that are used to like treat different GI distress, so laxatives, for example, those are going to flush out your microbiome. And so these different drugs can impact your microbiome in different ways as well. So if that's something you're concerned about, again, that's something I'd ask your pharmacist or your doctor about to see if there's anything you can be doing to kind of counteract those impacts.
Okay, so I know you're not a pharmacist, but I do have one more question regarding medications. But how about acid blockers? So I'm thinking like if you have gastric reflux or some antacid, I'm guessing when they say acid blockers.
Yeah, so there are,
go ahead.
I'm not sure about short-term effects if you're taking like Tums, for example, but there are like a lot of times people that have long-term gastrointestinal issues will be prescribed proton pump inhibitors. And so those will often influence your microbiome. But if that's something that you're really concerned about, I believe that there's H2 blockers, which are also used for the same thing. And those have been shown to have milder side effects. So again, if that's something you're concerned about, I think that's a really important conversation and a valid concern to bring up with your different healthcare providers.
Yeah, thank you. So what can you tell us about can diet impact the small intestine bacteria related to overgrowth? So if you have small intestinal bacteria overgrowth.
Mm-hmm. So I know that there's growing research on SIBO, or the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And a lot of times people will try to eliminate low foods that have different fibers because they believe that these will impact their health differentially. And so I think that that's another, I feel like I just keep referring people to their medical doctors and stuff, but I am a dietitian. I can talk to you about nutrients and foods. But I know that there are certain things within the SIBO diet which they'll tell you can't eat things like wheat, legumes, fruits, a lot of those foods that we think of as beneficial. And so I am not an expert in that specific condition, and I think that's a really tricky one that's really important to work really closely with a health team with, especially a dietitian that specializes in gastroenteral health, because you really want to make sure that you're cutting out foods that are really influencing that type of growth. and not necessarily eliminating them forever. So oftentimes these diets, you'll cut out the different foods for a short period of time and then gradually add them back in to figure out which of those is causing those issues. And so again, I think that's really important to consult with a medical team to make sure that you're still able to get the right amounts of fiber and different nutrients that you'd be missing if you were to cut out, for example, like what the internet would recommend if you were to Google it.
Right. That is very, very true. Always consult with your healthcare team. Absolutely. Are fiber supplements like psyllium husk helpful to the microbiota?
Yeah, so psyllium is actually a great type of fiber that benefits our microbes. And so it's actually a bulking agent. And so it's often used, I think, in constipation. And so it's not necessarily going to, so a lot of these fibers won't always be able to be broken down by our microbes, but they'll have their own benefits because they'll kind of absorb water within our GI tract, and that'll bulk them up and make our stool more bulky and make them more easy to pass. And so things like psyllium husk can really help with that and helping GI motility if that's something that you struggle with as well.
All right, you mentioned that yogurt's a great source of probiotics. However, this writer says that they were told by their doctor that the ultra pasteurized, the pasteurization kills a lot of the good probiotics, and it defeats the purpose of why people are eating it. And so what do you have to comment regarding that with the pasteurization?
Yeah, so the pasteurization is going to kill all of the microbes present. For those that don't know, pasteurization is a very high heat treatment, and the point of it is to kill all of the harmful pathogens that could be present in a food product, but it will also get rid of any beneficial bacteria there as well. And so I think oftentimes many of these food products, they'll actually add back in microbes after the pasteurization process. So they'll add back in what they know is beneficial. So oftentimes in yogurt, you'll see lactobacillus, and they'll add that back in after the pasteurization process. I know there's other products such as kombucha that's been pasteurized, and they add those back in after as well. And I know some brands of kombucha don't actually pasteurize. And so I think that is something important to look at because you do want to make sure you're consuming pasteurized food so that you're not getting potential pathogens in your food sources. But also in terms of yogurt specifically, I would say that aside from probiotics, yogurt is also a great form of dairy to get nutrients such as calcium and vitamin D as well. And so there's benefits to eating these different products that come from outside of the different microbes that are present.
So based on the research that you've shared today, are you recommending eating a variety of nuts, or are you recommending to stick with walnuts and almonds?
So based on this research, I can confidently back walnuts and almonds and their impact on our gut microbiome. I would say I know there's research out there on peanuts, and we're also trying to start a project on peanuts as well. And we also have an ongoing project on almonds to kind of confirm our findings and look at some other outcomes. And so based on this research, I can confidently back almonds and walnuts for impact on the microbiome. But based on the fiber content that's present in other nuts and legumes, it's safe to assume that those would also have beneficial impacts not only on our microbiome, but again, those health effects from the fiber that we saw in the beginning. So things like lowering cholesterol levels and glucose levels as well as contributing to satiety.
Okay, we have other questions in the chat, but they're more questions related to speaking with your pharmacist and physician related questions. So I'm just going to kind of just not bring those up. Let's see.
Okay.
Well, it looks like we've addressed the majority of the questions that are relevant to today's presentation. One question though, does freezing affect pre and probiotics, such as the content in avocados and bananas?
That is a great question. I know that oftentimes, like a probiotic supplement, they'll ask you to keep those in the fridge, and that's just because those probiotics are sensitive to heat and moisture, and so that'll kind of take care of that. In terms of the foods, I've never tried freezing avocado. I don't know how palatable it would be based on freezing, but those with like bananas, for example, those kind of start to break down as they freeze. Like you'll notice when you freeze bananas, they'll get the brown color and kind of mushy, and so they'll have a higher sugar content and not as much starch present. So I think the amount of time that it spends in the freezer, I would assume that the content would gradually go down, but not so much that I would say that you shouldn't be eating it. And I'm sure there would still be some positive benefits from there as well.
Okay, now does your research overlap with the study of IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome? So there is a question regarding following a FODMAP diet, but I know irritable bowel syndrome is something that's very individualized for people. It's not the same across the board. So how does your research impact, or how can it be beneficial for people looking for information regarding irritable bowel syndrome?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Our research is it's in its infancy. And so I think the microbiome is such an important field, and it's been growing very quickly, but we still have a lot to discover. And so for our research specifically, we look at healthy populations. But the long-term goal of my research specifically is to be able to create personalized diet recommendations based on individuals' microbiome. And so right now we're building that based on people that are metabolically healthy and don't have different disease states. So I can't comment on FODMAP. I feel like my research is directly in conflict with what a FODMAP diet says. But I think that's something that's really important to consider down the line. And I also know that the FODMAP diet, oftentimes it shouldn't be a permanent thing. So again, as I talked about earlier, with the SIBO diet, I think a lot of times you'll work with a dietitian to kind of avoid different foods and then gradually add different things back in to see what really is triggering that inflammation in your specific condition. And so I think down the line we can find ways to incorporate maybe not all of these foods, but different foods into diets for people that suffer from this type of condition.
Thank you so much. So thank you again for this presentation and for everyone attending. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us, and we would love to hear from you about what topics you would like to hear more about. So I'm going to draw your attention to the chat box, and we have an online survey that was just shared. And I just want to ask you to please complete that survey, that evaluation. And we, again, greatly appreciate your feedback. Thank you for participating, and we hope that we will see you next week.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you were on a phone and you were seeking CEUs or CPDUs, if you would unmute yourself and let me know that you are here today. Anybody calling in? I believe it's *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If not, you guys can all hang up, and we appreciate everybody attending today. Have a great week, and we hope you join us next week for our final session of the self-care series to learn about viral history, the Black Death, Spanish flu, and COVID-19.